Alright, YouTube, right now there is a plague outbreak in Madagascar. This is significant for several reasons. First, it has gone pneumonic, which means that the Yersinia pestis bacteria, whatever this strain happens to be, is more virulent than some other strains. Normally, the bubonic plague gets into a human or a few humans through a parasite, an infected rodent population with fleas. The fleas bite people, they get bubonic plague, and they die, usually with a high mortality rate. However, when it becomes pneumonic plague, it starts entering the lungs. Certain strains, I guess, do this more than others. It spreads like the common cold or the flu. Right now, I think it was like 80 people have gotten infected in Madagascar in the last week or so, and half of them have died. 50% mortality rate, the same as we saw in theory in Europe during the time of the Great Plague there, or the Plague of Justinian. Worrisome again because it's now spreading from human to human directly by coughing or whatever, and no longer needs a parasitic host. What they should do is completely quarantine the island of Madagascar until it goes away. They shouldn't be letting anybody in or out of the entire country for any reason. Unfortunately, they don't seem to have the foresight to ever do this when an epidemic emerges in an isolated area. And so they're just screening people and giving them antibiotics. The problem being, this could be one of those strains of Yersinia pestis that's already developed antibiotic resistance. You've got to understand, the plague still exists. It never went away. What did go away were large rodent populations in urban centers as a result of modern sewer systems. What did go away was the ability for the virus to spread easily because of antibiotics. But with antibiotic resistance and now the plague going pneumonic, it no longer needs a parasitic host. If one of these infected people, someone gets exposed to an infected patient, whether it's a doctor or just a regular citizen that gets exposed, and then travels, they're a business person or whatever, and travels to Johannesburg or Cairo or Lagos or one of these places, you could see millions of people get infected in a very short time. You got to remember, one of the reasons why the Black Death, particularly Justinian's plague, but later the one in the 1300s, one of the reasons that these plagues spread so quickly across the known world at the time and had such a high mortality, and why they developed the miasmatic theory, is because it spread so quickly. It's literally within days, it would move from city to city. Within weeks, it could be in a totally different kingdom. That's because pneumonic plague spread like the flu. Somebody would be asymptomatic and they'd still be able to transfer this virus to other people. And so they had no idea where it was coming from, and it was spreading very quickly. They had trade all across the Mediterranean at the time. There was trade up into the North Seas. And so it's within months, it covered, most of the coastal areas in Europe. Within years, it hit everything. In this day and age, you can travel from one side of the world to the other in 24 hours or less. So if it does leave Madagascar and hits a large urban center, what you could see is that the medical community, which is used to dealing with sporadic outbreaks at best, gets overwhelmed by suddenly hundreds of thousands of cases. There wouldn't be enough antibiotics. And people that I've already spoken to about this, they're saying, well, this is Madagascar. It's a third world country. Things are unclean there. There's lots of rats and stuff. It's no wonder they've got the plague. And I tried to point out to them, once it becomes pneumonic, you no longer need an unhealthy, unclean, rodent-infested, sewage-drenched area. It could be the most medically forward first world country, and it no longer matters because it's spreading like the common cold. If every year you get influenza outbreaks, we can treat influenza in the first world, but it doesn't matter. It still spreads anyway. Even with vaccinating people, giving them antibiotics, antiviral drugs, giving them all sorts of treatment, managing symptoms with other, ways of doing it if their symptoms are quite severe, their lungs are filling with fluid or whatever, it still spreads all over the world every single year. That's how this Yersinia pestis bacteria in Madagascar right now is spreading from person to person, through breathing, through coughing. It, again, no longer needs that parasitic host that usually relegates it to the third world. There are certain areas in the United States where there are plague cases. There were 4 cases of plague this year in the United States. And it never became an epidemic because you get one person who's infected and you identify the person infected. Unless it's gone pneumonia, they're really not a risk to other people. You simply have the doctors treat them. And you try not to get, bubo juice all over your hands. Once it becomes pneumonic, it's a different situation. What would be even worse is if it also goes septicemic and starts liquefying people who are infected so their organs just literally fall apart and start slopping out of both orifices. But I found it funny that I mentioned weeks and weeks ago about Comet Ison and the fact that it could coincide with a certain 333 and or 666 year cycle with comets that heralded other outbreaks of plague, which were particularly drastic and probably were pneumonic plague. I mean, other than pneumonic plague, there's no way to explain how quickly the Great Plague, the Black Death, actually spread. It couldn't have spread that quickly if it was just regular bubonic plague. I pointed that out weeks ago, and a lot of people were incredulous and said, well, that's just it's just nonsense. But here we are. Now there's a pneumonic plague outbreak in Madagascar. Do I think they're related? Maybe, probably not. But still, this is a bad scenario if it leaves Madagascar. This is an island. It's isolated. It's third world. It's got quite a few problems anyway, so it's not a huge surprise that the plague would have an outbreak there. What would be a lot worse, again, is if it hits one of these large cities with international airports. Madagascar is not known for a large amount of trade with other nations, for a large amount of travel with other nations, but it is linked up with Africa at large, and probably certain parts of Asia too. They have a capital like any other country. Even Nepal would have an international airport. So you've got the risk there where it spreads to other countries, to the mainland at large, leaves the island, and hits a densely populated urban area in such a form that it no longer needs parasitic-friendly conditions to spread. Which could essentially, in the worst case scenario, could go global and kill half the world's population. You'd have 4 billion people lying dead in the streets. I doubt they'd even be able to bury them all, really. And it would take, a century to recover from it. Again, is it likely? Hopefully the people from the Pasteur Institute and other groups will be able to get rid of this. Hopefully it does not become fully antibiotic resistant or anything like that, because then there's really no way to stop it. And I told people, you'd better hope that it stays in Madagascar, because if it does hit one of these urban areas, short of cordoning off the entire country and putting machine guns all along the border to kill anybody that tries to cross the border for any reason, short of firebombing their airports to prevent them from leaving by air, you're not going to be able to contain this. Because it's, again, spreading like the flu now. You'd probably you'd have to burn the whole country to the ground, try to disinfect it. It would be terrible for the world, especially now. You've got to understand, the Black Death back then was spreading through areas that we would consider sparsely populated. There weren't nearly as many urban centers. Towns were further apart. Travel was a lot slower. Medicine was a lot less developed. Sewer systems were more primitive, other than in Rome or some of these other very large cities. They generally didn't even have sewer systems. Rodents were everywhere. The idea of disinfection was extremely primitive, and within a few years, it spread across most of the known world. Well, now in this day and age, yes, we've got much better medicine. We've got sewer systems in all these towns. But also, we've got antibiotic-resistant strains, which they couldn't have been seeing back then because they didn't have antibiotics for them to be resistant to. You have world travel on a massive scale, and you have a much more densely populated world where it's much more easily spread. Influenza is the same way. It spreads across the entire world in a very short period of time, over months, usually every single year. And people die from that too, but its mortality rate isn't as high as a bacteria that's capable of literally liquefying your body if it's septicemic, capable of making your lungs hemorrhage if it's pneumonic, And in any case, even in the least drastic scenario, it's going to fuck up your lymph system, and it's probably going to leave you weakened and disease riddled for the rest of your life if you catch it. Extremely worrying. They should be quarantining the entire island. There should be no traffic out. And what traffic in should be people bringing supplies, staying there, and then leaving as quickly as possible and not going into any towns or cities. That's what they need to do for such a virulent outbreak. And again, link in the description.